So today we're very pleased to welcome Professor Celia Deane-Drummond, who's Professor of Theology and the Biological Sciences at the University of Chester. I actually think that's probably a unique description for a chair, isn't it? Theology and the Biological Sciences, and I would that we had a few more chairs of that kind in this country, but it's quite a kind of rare species. Celia started out doing natural sciences here in Cambridge and then went on to do various postdocs and other positions in plant physiology, ended up lecturing in science at Durham University, and then made the switch over to theology and has developed that whole new academic career since that time. And so her background and academic interests are very much straddling the two fields. She has written a lot of books. I can't keep up with all the books and chapters that are coming out, and her book coming out in 2 weeks' time, published by SCM Press. And can you remind us of the title, Celia? It's called just simply Christ and Evolution, is coming out in a couple of weeks' time. So if you want the fuller account of the seminar today, then that's the book to look out for. I'm sorry that it's not quite out in time for us to sell it off our bookstall. But today Celia is going to talk to us on this title, Beyond Separation or Synthesis, Christ and Evolution as Theodrama. So thank you.
I have a PowerPoint presentation to help us through where I'm going to go today. And I'm going to start off by introducing some of the themes that got me to the point of looking at this area of Christology and the evolution. And then I'm going to consider, first of all, the classical debate, and then the more liberal reactions to that. And I'm going to sort of challenge both of those, really, and end up with proposing an alternative based on the notion of theodrama. So I hope it'll be an interesting tour of this area. I am only touching on some of the issues that I raise in the book version, but please bear with me as I try and guide you through this account. And I have to say that when I was doing this on sabbatical leave, finished the sabbatical leave about a year or so ago, it was a great struggle to come and bring these two areas of thought together. It wasn't something that came particularly easily to me, and I think it's one of the most difficult books I've ever written. And I can see why, really, there has been this gap in looking at the relationship between Christology and evolution, even though there's been a great deal of concentration on looking at God and evolution and all the debates around creationism and all that whole area of discussion. The issue of Christ has somehow slipped away, and I can understand in some ways why this is the case, because it is a very challenging area to engage in. And of course, historically, the image of evolution of Christianity has been portrayed as something of a conflict. And Arthur Peacock, who I dedicate this particular book to, who died a year or so ago, he was representative of the notion of friendship between evolution and Christianity rather than anything else. And one of the reasons he argued for friendship was he believed that T.H. Huxley's opposition that he pitched between evolution and Christianity was based on his belief that the church was trying to gain a stranglehold over practicing biologists. Now, no one would want the church, if you like, to control biology, but of course in those days the church had far more political power and far more ability to influence the way things went in the scientific arena. He got the idea of friendship from Aubrey Moore, and the basic notion here is that actually Darwin acts as a friend because he's able to help us think more deeply about the nature of God, the nature of the relationship between God and the natural world, and also about who God is. God is not necessarily to be thought of in an interventionist kind of way, but in an alternative kind of way. On the other hand, those of you who are more familiar perhaps with Richard Dawkins' latest outpouring on the God delusion might be forgiven for thinking that the two areas are still in enmity with one another, that there is this clash between evolutionary biology and Christianity that maybe it's unresolvable. So we get these two possible positions, neither of which I think is strictly the case. And so therefore I think we need to think of creative and alternative ways forward to think about the relationship between evolution and Christianity, in particular focusing on that key and that core concept in Christian belief, and that's an understanding of who Christ is. Because there's not much point in, I mean, of course we can focus in on the question of God and evolution, and that will bring us into dialogue with Muslims, and it will bring us into dialogue with all those who are theists and believe in God. But it misses out the important and the crucial question, which I believe is thinking that marks the distinctive aspect of Christianity, which is who Christ is for us today. And it is surprising, perhaps, when I was looking into this, that those who've made it their profession to look at Christology, to understand who Christ is and the many faces of who Christ is in different cultures, have failed to consider the possible influence of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and how that might have an impact on our understanding of who Christ is. And so, as I say, we arrive at this gap with theologians talking about Christology, remote from scientific arena, and those in the science and religion dialogue perhaps making it their point to just represent God and evolution rather than Christ and evolution. But in order to find out, where we might start from, we need to look at perhaps some of the classical accounts, and of course the Chalcedon definition of 451 argued for attention of the twin aspects of Christ's nature as being both human and divine. And that was, if you like, the boundary within which the discussion was legitimised. It was illegitimate to think of Christ in any other way. The Alexandrian school emphasised the divinity of Christ, and that led to problems with trying to work out whether Christ had a soul or not, a human really had a soul. On the other hand, the Antiochian definition emphasised the humanity of Christ, and that led to difficulties with trying to conceive of a divine and human nature all in the same person. In addition to that, we have debates between anhypostasia and enhypostasia. These are technical terms meaning who Christ is in his humanity in an impersonal sense of the human nature of Christ, or is it about the particular person of Christ understood as the human person in the particular sense of who Christ is? So is it general humanity, or is it something particular to the humanity of Christ that's incarnate? And then we have the notion of perichoresis. That is the interrelationship between the three persons of the Trinity. Now, all these debates are closed, theological debates. But if you're not a theologian, you'll think, well, what on earth is going on about? It strikes me as being something that I cannot connect with, I cannot relate to, and I do not understand. And that's why we get reactions to the classic tradition, especially in as what I call the dominant models in science and religion, with Arthur Peacock, for example, talking more in liberal tones, that is liberal theology, about Jesus being a moral exemplar, or the archetype for what our humanity needs to be like. God's character as love is displayed in the person of Christ. Jesus appears as humanity made perfect. Jesus is emergent divine reality, and Jesus' divinity relates then to his perfect obedience. And all these, if you like, are ways of trying to come to terms with the fact that we live in an evolutionary world where Jesus is also named as God incarnate. So the incarnation, as it were, in Peacock's model is one which weakens the sense of the divine in his understanding of Christ, because Christ is emergent divine reality. Jesus is humanity made perfect. Theoretically, it would be possible for anyone else, perhaps, to become divine according to this model. So we end up with what I would call a naturalistic Christ. Jesus is the manifestation of what, or rather the one who, is already in the world, though not recognised or known. And this is a book that was published after his death, posthumously, in a book called All That Is, A Naturalistic Faith for the 21st Century. Ian Barber, on the other hand, is more strongly countering the two natures Christologies that he finds in the classic tradition. And he says this, although I have to say that in his book Religion and Science, there's only about half a page or so dedicated to Christology. All the rest is about God and relationship with science. So, but in the very short section that he does have on this, he says this. Excuse me. What was unique about Christ, in other words, was his relationship to God, not his metaphysical substance, even though he had two wills. He was also able to exercise human freedom and personal responsibility. And similar to Peacock, he draws on Geoffrey Lamp's understanding of spirit-filled Christology. Christ is understood then as a pattern of union between God and spirit and the spirit of humanity. Here then we're not challenged, as it were, to think of God in the classical sense of incarnate, but more a spirit-filled person. Christ is the model Adam, a new stage in evolution. Now, we need to pause at this point, not only for me to have a drink of water, but also to think about what this means in terms of our Christian understanding of the significance of Christ. What happens to redemption in this model? What happens to the newness of Christ? It becomes, in Barber's model, personal relationships, ideas, and the response of the community. That's the only newness that Christ seems to bring. For him, rather like the difference between animals and humans, you could say that the difference between Christ and other humans is just one of degree. Now, while I would agree with both Peacock and Barber that as far as the human nature of Christ is concerned, there is just a difference of degree, I also think that I would question two issues. One is, would I really be inclined to worship Christ as Lord, given this pattern of understanding of who Christ is as the next evolved Adam? Would I be inclined to believe that the whole of the natural order is somehow redeemed in Christ, according to this model of the human person stressed to such an extent that the divine seems to be given relatively little place? The classic notion then of God incarnate seems to disappear. So I'm questioning whether this is really enough, while I am sympathetic to some of the desires to move away from the classical account. And Barber says this: Christ is the distinctive and not the exclusive revelation of the power of God. And of course you can understand why he would say that, given his own sensitivity to other religious faith traditions. Christ is God's supreme act, and Christ's uniqueness is merely the content of God's aims for him and his actualization of those aims. Behind all these theologies lurks the thought of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who also tried to synthesize his evolutionary understanding, but it was evolutionary understanding according to a very progressive model, drawing more on Spencer rather than Darwin, with Christ. But now, in his model, Christ becomes emancipated from time and space, rather than simply emerging from evolution. And you can see why Barber and Peacock, drawing on Teilhard, resisted some of this focus on this emancipated Christ. But I would also say that the progress view that's embedded in Teilhardian thought is also true indirectly in Barber's model and in Peacock's model. In other words, this sense that Christ is somehow the next stage of evolution. But that idea of evolution progressing in some way owes its origin more to Herbert Spencer rather than Charles Darwin. And so therefore there's a serious flaw in all these models, one that I believe has been overlooked. If you look at what Teilhard says of Christ, he says that Christ is at the crossroads where everything can be seen, can be felt, can be controlled, can be vitalized, can be in touch with everything else. Is that not an admirable place in which to position, or rather to recognize Christ? The incarnation, according to Teilhard then, is understood in evolutionary terms. The cross is also understood in terms of cosmic activities. So Christ then, emancipated from time and space, seems to be not just explained by evolution. So we arrive at this disjunction between the evolutionary story, which both Peacock and Barber accept, and this strange emancipated Christ. And it becomes even clearer in this quotation here. In one of its aspects different from that in which we are witnessing its formation, it has always been emerging above a world from which, seen from another angle, it is at the same time in the process of emergence. He's talking there about Christ. His understanding of the future is one where it impinges on the present, and this is what renders the movement not only irreversible but irresistible. But that idea of the future impinging on the present isn't part of the evolutionary account, so there's some inconsistency in the way he's dealing with the topic. God at the same time is the prime psychic mover. So I'm going to just list some of the problematic issues in Teilhard. First of all, evolution as progressive becomes a sort of metaphysical theory in Teilhard's thought. Secondly, his anthropocentrism is inaccurate. If you look at the account of evolution by today's biologists, they will not suggest or never indicate that it's simply focused on the creation of humanity. It's much more like a branch effect rather than something that's going in a straight line towards human beings. The tight association of Christ and evolution is also problematic, in that Christ seems to be bound up with evolutionary processes. At the same time, there's a disjunction with his Christomonism, what I call, which is a technical word, meaning a focus almost exclusively on Christ. Christ becomes remote from the historical Jesus. There's a naturalisation of evil as well. It's a mistake to think that Teilhard didn't take into account evil. He did, but he saw it part of the naturalisation process. Peacock makes much the same mistake, I think, when he talks about evil somehow being naturalised. In other words, it's somehow justified on the basis of the evolutionary story, although interestingly enough, towards the end of his life, he admitted he hadn't really given this enough thought. So there's optimism about science and human progress. He even seemed to endorse the dropping of the bomb at Hiroshima, if you want a good graphic example, because he believed that it just showed what human ingenuity could achieve. So I think we need something else. In other words, I'm not satisfied with Teilhard de Chardin's linking of Christ and evolution, nor am I satisfied entirely with Barber or Peacock's account, even though I have some sympathy as to why they might move in that direction. And in order to create something a bit alternative, I've turned to the notion of Theodrama instead. According to this, the history of nature and the human history is part of a story, but at the same time, we need to be wary lest those stories become grand narratives. And those of you who are theologians here will know that in the postmodern culture in which we live, any kind of grand narratives are treated with something of suspicion. Theodrama is an alternative reading of history from a theological perspective. It doesn't weaken our theological element in the discussion, but if you like, it tells it in a slightly different way. And Theodrama weaves together then history and future hope. It's concerned with God's purposes. And to unpack this idea of Theodrama a little bit more clearly, I think we need to first ask the question, well, are theology and history compatible? Given that history has also been influenced by the scientific revolution and influenced by historical criticism and so on. In other words, you don't do history in the way they used to do history. In modern scholarship, it is inevitably influenced by science. But as Ben Quash says in his book on theology and the drama of history, he says that theologians are prepared to see the dense historical world as having an origin and an end in the creative purposing of God, a God who can relate personally to his creatures, people ready to acknowledge the idea that there can be a revelation, a prevenient ground for our knowledge and perception, which is not the product of our knowledge and perception, which is neither accidental or impersonal, which freely and even lovingly communicates itself. So in Theodrama, we're prepared to consider history and eschatology together. Drama is about human actions in particular contexts, and that's very important to stress. In Theodrama, we find actions, human actions, most properly speaking, certainly in Ben Quash's account, in relations to God's purposes. There's a stress on human agency, the stress on the context, stress on even the plot, what's going on in the drama, in the plot. It includes subjects, stage, as well as action and freedom. And certainly in the account of Panzer's von Balthasar, where I draw much of this from, the encounter between God and creation is at its most poignant, where freedom of the subject is preserved. So we have divine freedom, but we also have human freedom. It resists making either subjects or structures the key to the interpretation of history. So that's really an outline of what Theodrama is about. When we start to include evolution in the Theodrama, we first have to come with a premise that evolved creatures are more than just a stage. They're more than the stage on which human actors work out their life with God. Nature also becomes historical, and many authors, including John Hort and others, believe that actually one of Darwin's greatest discoveries was that nature is also historical, like human history. The common reading of history as genealogy or the dynamics of historical change also applies to evolutionary biology. So you get evolutionary psychology, treating the evolutionary story as a ground narrative. Some interpretations of Darwinian natural selection go down the same route. So it applies to human and evolutionary ground narratives. But if we include evolution in the drama, it's inclusive of non-human creatures, and in order to avoid the synchronic readings that Ben Quash speaks about, this is synchronic readings, that is what he calls epic readings of history, which are related to the ground narrative understanding of things. In this, they fail to give due attention to particulars, to the individuals, to the exceptions to the rules, to the resistances to explanation and the densities of meaning that ask for recognition in a good description of historical reality. So in other words, Theodrama does give attention to particulars, does give attention to individuals, does take account of exceptions to rules, it does look at resistances to explanation and densities of meaning, and it also, all of these together then, offer a much better account of historical reality than the grand narrative epic kind of approach. I would believe that the Christomonism of Teilhard commits to what I call the grand narrative fallacy, as does the aesthetic principles emerging in process thinking. Even the organic model of Lovelock, Gaia, commits much the same mistake. If we imagine evolution, on the other hand, as drama, it encourages the close examination of some creatures and scenes. And the particular scenes we might like to concentrate on might be the primates, it might be the early hominid understanding of the earliest human communities, or even the canids, that is dogs and wolves and so on, who many ethologists, animal ethologists argue, have communities quite similar to our own. But it also allows us to become much more aware, by focusing on these individual scenes, of our own great ignorance, as well as the tragic nature of the evolutionary story. So widening the drama takes account of the tragic in the way that I believe that grand narratives do not. In other words, there's a tendency to push underneath the surface the suffering and the tragedy of much of the processes of evolution. It also takes due account of contingencies. So it resists the generalization of evil and other ways of through that have plagued some evolutionary accounts. Tendencies for epic readings are also common in evolutionary psychology, and it presumes that we can somehow be outside as an observer, looking from the outside within, as it were, to the evolutionary account. Epic readings of theology are equally common, so this isn't something that's just true of evolutionary psychology. Epic readings of theology, and here Balthasar was referring to the ecclesial statements of the Church, in particular, that's the Catholic Church from which he belonged, and which I also belong myself. In this, Balthasar says this, that epic readings smooth out the folds and say that Jesus' suffering is past history. We can only speak of his continued suffering in an indirect sense, insofar as those who believe in him are referred to metaphorically as his members. So we end up with what he calls the genre of false objectification. In other words, we're somehow reducing the dynamism that is there by kind of objectifying, looking from the outside in, rather than recognizing something else. There have been, of course, reactions to epic theology in what's known as lyric readings, which are much more individualistic and very common in mystical interpretation, so it's quite understandable that some people will turn to mysticism given this kind of scenario. And for Quash, he says this, that the whole substance of an action is transposed into a highly volatile, highly individual, immediate and emotionally coloured mode of response and expression. Other reactions to epic, and this is an image of Balthasar, might be theopraxy, and he's quite critical of those who focus in on the practical aspects of theology as a way of countering some of what he calls the dry statements of the official church teaching. But there is an alternative as well, an alternative that he supports in 5 volumes of his Theodrama, where he talks about the action of God in history. And the anticipation in Theodrama does not lead to resignation, whereas if you have an epic account, an account that's according to a particular reading, you tend to be resigned about what's going to happen next, because it all seems very inevitable. Of course, one of the influences on Balthasar was Ignatius of Loyola, and he allowed a positive attitude to the natural world where he found God in all things. He also allowed the combination of lyric elements into his thinking by Ignatius. But it opens the way for inclusion of creation in the Theodrama. And although Balthasar didn't develop this himself, he says this of creation. He says that it so overarches everything from beginning to end that there is no standpoint from which we could observe and portray events as if we were uninvolved narrators of an epic. By wanting to find such an external standpoint, allegedly because it will enable us to evaluate the events objectively, we put ourselves outside the drama, which has always drawn all truth and all objectivity into itself. In this play, all the spectators must eventually become fellow actors, whether they wish it or not, wish to or not. And I believe this has implications also on how we think about the incarnation in particular. Kenotic Christology, then, is understanding Christ in relation to kenosis, or self-emptying. But it's not about Christ giving up divine attributes in order to become Jesus of Nazareth. It's about God in God's self becoming who Christ is, not so much through focusing on the essences of the human and divine nature, but through the filial response, that is, the response of Jesus to God, which unites the human Jesus and the divine Son in a Trinitarian way. The atonement is understood primarily in terms of the kenotic love of the Trinity as well. But here we need to be inclusive of what we might call the sin of creaturely being. So we don't need to confine original sin just to human beings. To some extent, the original sin had cast the shadow back on the evolutionary story. But if we're going to move on to thinking more specifically about evolutionary perspectives, it wouldn't be fair to you to leave this lecture without talking to you about some of the biologists who have also touched on this in some of their work, although I would say incidentally rather than in any elaborated way. Geoffrey Sloss is a biologist who taking the idea from Evelyn Hutchinson, in one of his articles on the resurrection, says this. He speaks of evolution here as a drama. He says that the lines, the players, and even the plot may change over the evolutionary time, though they are ever constrained by the props and setting and choreographic syntax of the ecological moment. The dramatic includes indeterminacy, and that I think is very important if you know anything about the evolutionary account of Stephen Jay Gould and others, we need to be able to include indeterminacy. Performance also allows the inclusion of other creatures. In Schloss's account, the ideal and the actualized niches in evolutionary history point towards a heaven in the ideal, although he also says that biologists wouldn't go down the route of any sort of teleology, but they are able to talk about talk about optimal states. In other words, the ideal can be interpreted as optimal if you're a biologist. You don't have to go down the theological route. But at the same time, Schloss rejects any developed teleology. That is an understanding of purpose. And one of the reasons for this is he believes that there's no evidence for an inevitable increase in complexity in the evolutionary story. There's no evidence that creatures have become more mutualistic or better with time. In other words, there's no evidence for any sort of moral advance as the evolutionary account has gone on in the evolutionary terms. He also tries to extend Dawkins' account of the extended phenotype to the understanding of the resurrection. So he believes there's some analogy between how we see or could be an analogy between how we see the resurrection and Dawkins' extended phenotype. So Christ in the resurrected form influences other bodies beyond himself. Quite apart from the fact that I think Dawkins would shudder to think that his views are being used to actually reinforce concepts of the resurrection, I'm not particularly convinced that Christ is somehow a risen superorganism in the way that Schloss implies. Trends in evolution do show variable processes, and as much as Schloss suggests this, I do agree with him, in that there has been an increase in body size, there has been some increase in certain levels of organisation, but there's also been an increase in competition, which makes him quite wary of tying in future hope to the process of evolution itself, and where I think that I would also agree with him. In other words, we need to be careful of winding in our theology into the evolutionary story to such an extent that the evolutionary account doesn't have something of its own integrity. And Schloss says this, that a critique of eschatologies based on the evolutionary aesthetics is that we have fashioned God after our own fallen image, at precisely the cultural moment when theology needs to recall us in eschatological hope to the renewal of his moral image within us. So what he's saying here is that accounts such as John Hort's evolutionary process model, which, if you like, looks to the future of evolution as the next stage in an aesthetic appreciation of who God is, that is really a mistake. He doesn't. Hort does mention Christ, but it's woven into the process in much the same way that Barber's writing is. And Schloss is here commenting on John Hort's particular book, Theology After Darwin. So he's saying that actually we need to challenge some of that. I mean, as much as Schloss does challenge it, I think I would agree with him. But I also think we can, as I've said earlier, develop this idea of theodrama in a very theological way, in a way that makes sense for theologians as well as makes sense for biologists. So I'm going to run through now some conclusions, really, to what I've said so far. Again, I'm sorry it's very compressed, but I hope to give plenty of time for discussion where you can raise some issues yourselves and I can fill out some of this a little bit further. First of all, theodrama avoids the problems of simple endorsement of evolution. We're not saying that the relationship between Christ and evolution, or even God and evolution, is one of endorsement. It gives due weight to Christ's significance without weakening the role of evolution. Each has its own integrity, but there is, if you like, an overlapping between them that allows one to be considered with the other. It provides a metaphor then of how to think through Christology and evolution. And it challenges both theology and evolutionary theory in a way which I try to take up, as I say, further in the book that I've written. I'm just this is just a plug really with Fortress Press. It was published with Fortress Press in the US, but then SCM decided they were interested in it as well. So this is just to show you very briefly where I go in this. And the work that I've dealt with today is just looked at part of chapter 1, which is Christology and Evolution is Theodrama. I also engage more deeply with Christology secularized, what I call, because I argue that actually evolutionary psychology is a form of secularized Christology. And then I look at Christ as divine incarnate wisdom in the thought of Sergei Bulgakov, and then deep incarnation, Christ the form of beauty, is the glory of the Lord, books in Balthasar, and that's more natural theology. And then I go to looking at the atonement, the risen Christ, and then the new community, eschatological wonder, and then finally I finish with thinking about transhuman evolution or human identity as imago Christi. So there's a lot. What I'm trying to say is there's a lot more to it than I've given you today. But I hope I've given you enough of a flavour to show why this particular approach offers something a little bit different from either the separation or the synthesis that has been the case up till this point. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you very much, Celia. We've got some good times for questions and discussion. Just while you're thinking of your questions, I've just thinking if you've seen this week's issue of Nature, there's a whole series of articles on evolution in celebration, of course, of Darwin's birthday. And the introduction to that is quite interesting in this whole discussion about Gould and so on, and comes out rather strongly saying, well, current evolutionary understanding and recent publications actually don't make it look as stochastic as Gould thought. And I just throw that out as a comment. It's in the current issue of Nature. I thought was quite interesting for somebody to come out that strongly actually in that context. Over to you for questions. Yes.
Could you tell us, please, very briefly, where evolutionary psychology is taking us in dealing with this concept?
Okay. Evolutionary psychology tries to explain, mostly through talking about mental modules, exactly what human behaviour is according to an evolutionary model of certain modules being developed which have evolved over time. And they take us back to the era of evolutionary adaptativeness, which is the sort of earliest hominid societies. And what they say is that the kind of characteristics that evolved in these modules at that stage were adapted to that particular era, and we're lumbered with that now. And so therefore we shouldn't feel guilty about our attraction to sugar and eating cakes and so on. This is all part of what we were evolved to be like at that stage of our evolutionary pathway. And of course, for my mind, it's Christology secularized because it's about how we deal with guilt. It's saying it's just a natural thing, it is understandable, we want to go around and be sexually promiscuous or whatever the other ways that we think, because that's what nature is telling us to do or told us to do at that stage in our evolutionary history. But there's much a deeper reason why I bring it up here, and that is it's a narrative. In other words, it doesn't allow for any possible objection or exception to the rule. It's also, I'd say, not necessarily Darwinian, and Stephen Jay Gould and Stephen Rose and others have criticised it from the point of view of science because it's about a sort of design model. In other words, this is what we needed and this is how it evolved, and it's a very odd. It seems to sort of lose the Darwinian sense that everything is much more spontaneous and contingent. So you lose some of that in evolutionary psychology because the language they use is almost the language of engineers. And my husband's an engineer, so I know what it's like. So, and it's actually an extraordinary grand narrative because it doesn't, and it is surprising how this has taken off in the way that perhaps some of the early sociobiology of E.O. Wilson and others, that was perhaps dismissed by many, but this evolutionary psychology has really taken a grip, especially in the undergraduate population. So I would say that it needs to be challenged, not just scientifically, but also theologically. And I think that one of the reasons it's attractive to people is because it does develop this kind of secularized, what I call secularized Christology, something that deals with guilt, it deals with a sense of the future, it deals with who we are in relation to others and so on, in a way that traditional Christology attempts to do. So, you know, I'm sure they wouldn't be happy with me suggesting that it's some sort of implicit religious motivation there, but that's the way I read it.
Thank you.
Yes, question. Yeah. Yes.
I would challenge that in that evolutionary psychology simply claims to offer an explanation of why we have tendencies to what we might call sin. It doesn't justify that we go along with it. To say that something, an impulse is in us for natural reasons is no excuse for giving in to it, any more than a theologian saying we have original sin, saying, well, that's built in, so why worry about it?
Of course, those evolutionary biologists who are more responsible will say that's not an excuse. But at the same time, it can be used in a court of law, as it were, or could be used as evidence as to why someone had the particular tendency. In other words, if it's something that's inherited and something that's there because of the natural basis for it, I would challenge two things. One, the natural basis for it, I think, is based on speculation rather than hard evidence. And secondly, I believe that especially the way it's taken up in the popular media and in the public debate, it does become a justification for actions, even if biologists themselves would claim that it's not their intention. That's the way it's read. So I'm saying that it becomes a Christology secularized. I'm not saying that those biologists who are serious scholars in this field are necessarily like that. Of course not. But what I would say is that the temptation is to take the next step and to say that maybe this explains why we behave in this kind of way. And certainly they seem to give very detailed explanations of why women have certain preferences for men and why men have certain preferences for women, according to certain sort of stereotypic models of what they might be attracted to. Now, I don't actually believe that they have enough evidence for that kind of scenario, especially when you look at the way they've come back and looked at the same socio-cultural situations again and found there's suddenly been very strong shifts away from that. In other words, women don't always choose men that are wealthy and so on. So in other words, and much of this, as I said, isn't based on sufficient scientific knowledge. So if it was decent science, I would be far more prepared to endorse it. But I'm worried about the science, and I'm worried about the philosophical and the theological and the sociological implications of some of what they're saying. So.
Yes.
How would the Theodrama approach treat more hard metaphysical claims about Christ, the divine divinity of Christ, the full divinity of Christ? So, or in other words, how much in the drama approach becomes in our head, and how much still remains out there?
Okay. I think what Balthasar wanted to do was to retain what was behind the Chalcedon definition. In other words, he didn't want to weaken the sense of the divine, and he certainly didn't want to weaken the sense of the humanity of Christ. So in other words, God is divine to such an extent that God can become fully incarnate in the human. He's not trying to reduce the transcendence of God or reduce that sense of the divine nature. He's also not trying to weaken the sense of the Trinity. So that's where it differs from, say, the more liberal versions that say that Christ is a divinely inspired human being. It is a kenotic Christology, but it's one that's also followed by the Orthodox theologian and philosopher Sergei Bulgakov, for example, whose work I draw on quite a lot in this book, in his kenotic understanding of wisdom incarnate. So I would say that Theodrama keeps God as director of the play, as it were, but it's also to some extent an improvisation at times as well, so it's not something that's rigidly determined. So you get the element of freedom coming in there without losing the sense of Christ also being God incarnate. So I wouldn't want to weaken that sense of the incarnation. In fact, I would say that the incarnation of Christ affirms the natural world in the way that other sort of more models which lean more towards what I would call pantheist traditions do not. So I would say that it's in Christ we see that the Logos, but also wisdom incarnate in a way that you don't find in any other creature, but that in a sense that faith or that belief in the incarnation then has impacts on how we treat the rest of the creaturely world. So in other words, we get behind the spirit of Chalcedon, but we don't have to talk about two natures coming together in the same way. We can talk about Christ in the filial response of obedience, showing his divine nature, but it's not like a fixed nature that's sort of somehow a substance. It's not an ontological. It's more of a working out in action. That's the way we understand the divinity. So it's not denying the divinity of Christ or denying the humanity of Christ, but it's seeing it worked out and worked through in activity, in the activity of the life of Christ, and the activity of who he is on earth, especially in the resurrection. In the resurrection account, then suddenly the divinity of Christ becomes at its most visible. But I would say that then gets behind the spirit of Chalcedon in claiming that we have the divine and human in Jesus, but we avoid this ontological fusion of natures. So that's what I want to object to, the ontological fusion, which doesn't make much sense, or find it's difficult to make sense of it in post-Enlightenment thought. But I don't want to then go down the liberal route of just affirming a sort of divinely inspired human, because I don't think that then is sufficient theologically.
Yes, there's a question back there.
What would a Theodrama of natural history look like? I kind of get the feeling from your chapters.
Yeah. Well, a Theodrama of natural history, it would be an immense task to do all of it. In other words, because you'd be looking at separate scenes and separate instances where, if you like, you'd almost have a freeze where looking at evolution at one point in the overall history. In other words, you would focus in on that particular act or action. So you can't possibly, the human mind couldn't possibly comprehend everything, which is why I'm saying you have to be selective to some extent, which is why I think that looking maybe at the primate evolution or aspects of hominid evolution may be helpful, other aspects of, especially if you wanted to understand the human-animal boundary, which is again very hard and difficult to interpret. But I want to say that most biologists will specialise. If you look at Simon Conway Morris, who's at this university, he specialises in the Burgess Shale. So did Stephen Jay Gould. They both happened to look at the same period of evolutionary history, and they came up with completely different accounts. So they had different versions. And I would say that Simon Conway Morris's approach, which is more about a sort of convergent evolution, that would still work on the Theodrama model. And so would Stephen Jay Gould's model, because it includes this element of indeterminacy. And in fact, Stephen Jay Gould, in his massive book, The Theory of Evolutionary Theory, did allow for some direction in the evolutionary process. And Simon Conway Morris also allows for some contingency. But the way they've been portrayed is that they're at sort of loggerheads. Whereas I think Theodrama does allow for this sense of direction, but it also allows for the contingency, and that's why I think it's powerful, because it does allow these different interpretations of evolution to come together. It doesn't necessarily come down with one side or the other, although the thought of punctuated evolution in Stephen Jay Gould's work, which again is quite controversial, that could be thought of possibly in a theodramatic way, but it's not essential to have that model. In other words, it's not tied into any specific model of evolutionary theory, although it does affirm, the basic thought of Darwinian evolution by natural selection. It can accommodate that, as it were. Yeah.
Bob, yes.
Can you expand a little bit how Theodrama copes with the two big problems of human existence, or two of the big problems, which are our experience of injustice and our experience of suffering? Because the way you put it, it sounds as if the director isn't quite in control, and is a rather weak God in that sense.
Well, I wouldn't want to give the impression that God is weak. You would need to read Hans Urs von Balthasar's 7 volumes of the Glory of the Lord and 5 volumes of Theodrama, and then by the end of that, and then the 3 volumes of Theologic. The suffering of Christ on the cross is also pivotal here in the Theodrama. In other words, it's embedded in the Theodrama. There is the dramatic narrative of Jesus of Nazareth. So Theodrama is about story or narrative coming together with the lyric. It's not about weakening a sense of God's agency, but it's about allowing some room for contingency where it has a reasonable place for it. So just as Thomas Aquinas allowed some room for secondary causes and primary causes, I would say that Theodrama creates space for some of that where it's not necessary to imagine an alternative. When it comes to the incarnation of Christ and comes to the resurrection of Christ, the story is a little bit different, because that is, as it were, the pivotal action of God in history at that particular moment. That it is one of the most poignant, dramatic moments in the whole of the Theodrama. So, and again, the pointing towards the future hope is one where Christ takes a proper place. So I would say it's one that's informed by our own understanding of Christology. It's also one that gives room for the work of the Spirit in creation. It gives room for the work of God in creation as well at the beginning. But instead of seeing the natural world as just a stage on which human activity is played out, now the actors themselves, the agents as it were, become more widely inclusive. In other words, it becomes inclusive perhaps of those species that do have some form of consciousness. So in other words, it's about bringing in rather than excluding. So it's actually a stronger version of the divinity, I would say, than some of other versions that tend to just focus on the human and not look more broadly into the sort of cosmic aspects of the significance of Christ or the action of God in Christ. So it's a cosmic Christology, and it's one that allows that without going down the Christomonism route of Teilhard, that tend to separate the figure of Christ from the rest of his history on earth and so on. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but I've done my best.
There's a question at the end here, and then we'll go back to Katie after that.
My question fits in with that in a way, and how does your Theodrama interact with Christ reconciling the whole of creation to God in, say, Colossians?
Yeah, I mean, this to me is pivotal, really. It's a shame I can't, haven't got another hour to go into this. But if you see the incarnation as being deep incarnation, that is, it's an understanding of Christ's significance, not just for human species, but for the whole of the natural world. Then drawing on Colossians 1 and also Philippians and so on, we have a much richer sense of the drama of the whole of the natural world being included in that Christ moment. And if you see that, then also the resurrection is also one that's inclusive rather than exclusive for the human community. So I think you could draw on some biblical sources here, as well as some of the other sources in Balthasar and others, to reinforce this notion, especially Colossians 1, this notion that just as the evolved and the natural world, the world of creation, is included in the first moment of creation, it's also included in the redemptive moment as well. So one of the chapters in that book, in my book, which is on eschatology, is about including the non-human in the eschaton, but it's done in a way which, if you like, takes due note of where different species are in evolution and so on. So it tries to, I mean, it is a very difficult area, I think, and it's one where you bump up against the border of speculative theory, and certainly Jürgen Moltmann over-speculated, and I would want to end up more on what I would call the lyric account, which is more of a mysticism that says that you can go so far but no further. In other words, that we may end up with a mysticism the mystical view incorporated into this that allows us to keep something of the apophatic tradition as well as the cataphatic tradition. So we can't spell out in detail exactly what the future is going to be like, but what we can hope for is that all creatures will be included in the eschatological movement. So it's not a weakened Christ, it's a Christ that is, if you like, one that's pivotal in terms of the Theodrama, but it's also including other creatures rather than diminishing them to just the stage on which human activity is played out.
Katie.
Yeah, you kind of answered some of the things in my head that I was wondering about, but I can't quite understand how you bring together, because you're drawing on the scriptural understanding of Christ and Christology. So how does that then, would you ever be able to use biology to understand how that interacts with the physical creation and evolution as we would understand it today in the kind of genetic sense. You can actually explore it and understand it, measuring things and looking at them through fossils. How does that work together? And also then, how does that all come together with kind of like, is there a level of spiritual evolution, cultural evolution, biological evolution? How does that all kind of come together? And is it just specific to that particular period? And what happens afterwards? Lots of questions.
Stephen Jay Gould, in his mammoth 1,300-page epic book called The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, actually made some quite astonishing claims towards the end of his book, because he talked about the holy being emergent in the story of evolutionary biology, as it were, as he saw it. And I would say something of that is implicit in, if we go down just the purely biological route, there's a sense in which we do touch on wonder, as it were, which is why wonder is also a subtitle of my book, Wonder and Wisdom. We touch on that wonder that's there in the evolutionary account. Now, when we talk about Christology, or broadening out Christology to include other creatures, that language is very much theological. So you have what I would call the theological discourse on one side, and then you have the scientific discourse on the other. I don't think they're non-overlapping magisteria in the way that some of the earlier Gould suggested, but there is an overlapping zone between the two, like a sort of Venn diagram, where the boundaries are more blurred. And it's in that sort of blurred boundaries that we can start talking about, use the language of theodrama, because I believe that within that understanding of God's agency, both being inclusive of the natural world, but also recognising the importance of the human, so not diminishing the significance of the human, but including the non-human, then we can bring in or weave in this account of natural history. It's part of the drama of who God is, God's action in history. God's action in history is not just about human history, it's also about the history of evolution. It's the history of how we understand those evolutionary processes as a biologist. You know, so that's all, what you're doing is unpicking what has been going on, but I don't want to tie in God to the evolutionary account to such an extent that then God or Christ becomes identified with that evolution as if they're one and the same. And I think that's the problem of where I would see the two areas not just overlapping but merging in some way. So some of the discourse that I'm speaking about here makes most sense to theologians, some makes most sense to biologists, and then you have this overlapping zone in between where there's maybe this area of discussion, and I don't think that the two non-overlapping magisteria works, but I think that overlapping magisteria work. So there are times when our theological language will not impinge on the biological language, and there are times when the biological language will not impinge on the theological language, and that doesn't bother me. But what I am trying to suggest is that there are ways of thinking creatively about how to bring both in and give up and affirm both without wanting to fuse the two together in a sort of marriage, which is what, of course, Teilhard de Chardin tried to do. And he ended up with what I call, on the one hand, an affirmation of the evolutionary story in relation to Christ, but on the other hand, a remote Christ that didn't seem to have much to do with the historical Jesus. So it's not surprising that liberal versions that have used him have dropped all of that completely and have weakened the role of Christ entirely. So this is about trying to be faithful to the theological tradition while allowing for biological insights at the same time. But I don't want to give the impression that this theodrama, as it were, explains absolutely everything in biology, or necessarily accounts for absolutely everything in theology. There are other languages that we can use. It's an attempt, as it were, to allow some sort of alternative to either this hostility or synthesis that I see evident.
Well, thank you, Celia, very much indeed. I think that was, your last sentence was an especially good sentence on which to sort of summarise, and we worked hard. So thank you very much indeed for a very stimulating summary.